Welcome back to Neutrality Studies, and today I'm joined by Hugh Miles, an award-winning author and investigative journalist specializing in the Middle East and North Africa. Hugh recently wrote an illuminating article in the online outlet arabdigest.org. The piece carried the title Surviving the Hybrid War: How Iran Thwarted a Western Israeli Regime Change Attack. This is what we want to discuss today. So, Hugh, welcome.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Hugh, this was a very interesting article in which you are actually pointing out on how many levels this was a very coordinated attack on Iran. And maybe can you just lay out your interpretation of how this attack unfolded and what the different stages were?
Okay, sure. What's happened in Iran in the last few weeks, to understand it, is you have to really look back at what happened last year in 2025, when Donald Trump said that he was going to step up his maximum pressure campaign on Iran. And obviously in July, there was the 2-week war with Israel. So the situation was very tense. And so after the economic pressure stepped up on Iran, Donald Trump put more sanctions on Chinese oil refineries who buy Iranian oil, and say this increased the already huge economic pressure on Iran that has been, obviously building over the years, ever since the end of the JCPOA, really, and before that. So the pressure was mounting, and then finally this all came to a head in around New Year, when if you remember at New Year, Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu met together, and they had this they were together over New Year, and then soon after that there was a complete collapse of the Iranian rial, and it lost 30 or 40% of its value. And this was celebrated by American officials as being a success of the maximum pressure campaign. And this triggered protests in Iran, as you would expect. And so at the beginning of January, there were protests which were initially peaceful. And then after about 3 days of peaceful protests, suddenly they exploded into this rampage of violence. And we saw there was this deluge of videos coming out of Iran showing people fighting, lots of people being killed, people firing machine guns, fighting with machetes, setting fire to mosques, and complete chaos across the country. And at the same time, the Western media began to this tsunami of propaganda, if you like, that's saying that the plucky Iranian pro-democracy demonstrators were being brutalized by the regime, and that it was the West had to do something. And so the case for war was being very quickly established in a way that was really very reminiscent of what happened in 1991, if you remember, before the invasion of Iraq, when they talked about Kuwaiti babies being pulled out of incubators and so on. So there was a lot of kind of talk about atrocities and human rights abuses. And at the same time, the Western media also reported that there were thousands and thousands of these Starlink terminals. The New York Times reported there were 50,000 Starlink terminals that were in Iran, and that this ragtag group of pro-democracy,
and they used that term, ragtag. It was in the New York Times, a ragtag group, just like a eclectic group of opposition figures who managed to just get 50,000 panels in.
Well, I mean, exactly, and I mean, clearly this begs the question. I mean, how on earth could ragtag pro-democracy demonstrators get tens of millions of dollars worth of high-tech equipment in a embargoed, heavily sanctioned country. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, because like getting these Starlink panels into Iran is not only against how Iran runs the show, but also against the sanctions from the US, right? It would be an infringement of US law to export that to Iran, right? So
indeed. So, there are multiple, logistical, financial, practical reasons why all of this is just totally unimaginable. And at the same time, American politicians, Israeli politicians, leaders, including Israeli Mossad themselves, and were taking responsibility for these demonstrations. Israeli media said that Mossad is on the ground in Tehran. Mossad itself put out tweets in Farsi saying that they were supporting the riots or the protests or whatever you want to call them. At New Year, Mike Pompeo, who was the former CIA director, said that there was Mossad walking around the streets in Iran preparing. So they were very open about it. The Israelis were very proud of it, and there was talk on Israeli talk shows on Channel 14 where Israeli journalists said that Mossad is driving the protests in Iran, and that they're killing people on the ground. They're killing and that they've killed security services, and they said that they're bringing in weapons. And the Iranians showed thousands, tens of thousands of weapons, which this was shown in Iranian media, which the Iranians said that they had found and confiscated and were being smuggled in to these protesters. I mean, all in all, it just looked very clear that this was not a organic, natural protest against the Iranian authorities as it was being presented in the West, but rather it looked very much like the familiar CIA MI6 playbook that we have seen many times before in many countries, including Iran in 1953, where what happened then was very similar to what happened now, which is that you collapse the economy, which is, obviously the Western countries are well placed to do that. They did it in 1953 by stopping Iranian oil exports there. And so then there are protests. And then the next step is when there are natural protests, you then pay agitators and you distribute weapons and you encourage them to create chaos. And then the regime cracks down and there's blood in the streets. And then you use this either to pressure the regime to stand down, as happened in 1953, or, as appeared to be the plan in this case, to intervene militarily and to take some kind of action to finish the job and get rid of the regime. And this appeared to be the plan, but the Iranians managed to stymie the plan, because after a few days of total chaos in Iran, where we saw so many videos of violence and destruction, the Iranians they switched off the internet, and with help from the Russians, who are very experienced in handling Starlink technology because they are familiar with it from Ukraine, where Starlink is used to maneuver drones. The Russians knew exactly how to switch it off and locate the terminals. And so apparently this is what the Iranian security services did. And there were lots of arrests and these terminals were confiscated. And once the agitators could no longer coordinate, the protests immediately stopped. And then what happened is there were vast pro-government demonstrations in Iran where certainly tens of thousands, I mean, obviously it's very difficult to know. The Iranian regime claimed there were millions of people. I mean, I don't think that's very likely, but certainly the video showed what looked like tens of thousands of Iranians on the street supporting the government. Which, obviously that they wouldn't do. They didn't have to do. They didn't all have to come out if they didn't want to. And so there were these mass pro-government demonstrations and rallying around the flag, and many videos of Iranians saying that they, were supporting their government and so on. And of course, none of this was reported in the Western media at all. I mean, the Western media was once again, totally misleading in its coverage. It peddled this line that was apparently aimed to pave the way for foreign intervention. So, which of course is, what we've come to expect from Western media. We know that Western media is pathologically anti-Iranian, and, does not represent Israel-Iran conflict fairly. So that's what we saw. So
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below, and now back to the video. It is also like even social media was flooded, right? Especially Twitter X. I think I've never seen that many, or I have seen that many in the context of the genocide, but with Iran, it's just amazing, like how many accounts started posting videos that they claimed were anti-government protests that later were like labeled clearly either pro-Iranian government protests or nothing to do with Iran at all. There were so many pictures that actually showed protests in the US, in US streets with stop signs of accounts which like seriously claimed, look, they're attacking with gas when like was used with some kind of like pepper spray or whatever, and clearly from the United States. I mean, there was a massive online social media attack or approach at narrative shaping, right? Just massive.
It was phenomenal. I mean, The Guardian, for example, in 1 week, I counted 74 articles on
74.
Iran. 74 articles published on Iran in 1 week. I mean, it's it's extraordinary. This tsunami, all of course, saying essentially the same thing. Like you say, there was a lot of misrepresentation of the videos. The BBC Newsnight misrepresented pro-government demonstrations as anti-regime demonstrations. The BBC also misquoted the supreme leader when he said that thousands of people have died. They've been killed by Mossad-backed agitators, and the BBC did not report his full statement. They said thousands of people have died without giving it the necessary context, saying that he was saying that this was done by Mossad and CIA armed agitators, which was his full statement, but they omitted that. And of course, there was also this very famous performance of this Iranian dissident, this emigre lady called Masih Alinejad, who appeared at the United Nations, and she cried and she talked about millions of Iranians being killed. And this was reported by Reuters and broadcast all around the world. And they did not mention the fact that this lady, according to WikiLeaks in 2009, was a U.S. intelligence asset, right? She's in WikiLeaks, and it says that her identity has to be protected. And also, they did not mention that according to public U.S. government information, she's been paid over $800,000 to make propaganda against Iran while she's been in exile in the West. And of course, Reza Pahlavi, who's the son of the Shah, who lives in Maryland and can't go to Iran. He was front and center. So all the opposition groups, we're talking about the monarchists, the Kurds, the MEK, which are this weird cult who fought with Saddam Hussein against Iran in the Iran-Iraq war. They're all given airtime, and so it was, all the stops were pulled out really by the West to try and collapse the regime. And of course, it's worth pointing out, of course, that the Iranian government Iran is not a threat to America, right? It's not of any strategic consequence. This is all about Israel, and ultimately, this is all about Iranian independence and Iranian support for Palestine, and that is what's driving this whole extraordinary this project to try and overthrow the regime.
Yeah, and there's nothing surprising at the Israelis and Americans trying to do that. A lot of us in this alternative social media space have been expecting that something would happen toward November, December 2025, because it was utterly clear that after the 12-day war, that what the end of that war was just a ceasefire, but not the end of it. And people like John Mearsheimer and so on have said, look, it's a strategic imperative for the Iranians, for the Israelis to finish the job now that the Iranians are relatively weakened, not completely, but relatively. So they would obviously want to do it again. And the surprising thing is how the Americans and the Israelis went about it. It's not an open attack the way that the 12-day war was an open attack, just like with missiles flying and trying to decapitate the regime. It was the regime change CIA kind of underground approach, but it failed in the end. The hard blow with the military didn't materialize. Now, why is that?
Well, I think it's down to a number of reasons. I mean, clearly the Iranian regime was managed to ride out this storm, and that shows it has resilience. I mean, I can think of a number of possible reasons why, but I mean, I would think that one fundamental reason that this failed and that the 1953 coup worked, and similarly there are other examples, right, where the CIA has done exactly the same playbook, like for example,
Ukraine. I mean, the Maidan. This is the Maidan approach.
Right.
Organic protests, make them bloody, have them kill people on both sides, and boom.
Yeah. And Allende in 1973, Chile again, economic collapse leads to the erecting the Pinochet dictatorship, which was the same playbook. But I mean, to answer your question, why did this happen? I mean, I think the reason this happened is because the power of America and the West is diminishing, and that they no longer have got the influence to control the developing world or the third world or whatever you want to call it in the way that they have done through history. And this is, down to all sorts of reasons. But one of the key reasons, I believe, is because of America has lost its mojo, it's lost its aura. We've all witnessed this horrific ongoing genocide for the last 2 years. Where America and Britain is, completely complicit and culpable, and all the Western institutions have defended it, and the Western media and the Western politicians, and we've all been totally shocked to see, all the rule book thrown out the window, international law trampled underfoot. And now we have Donald Trump in the White House, who just epitomizes everything that is unattractive about America. He's such a liar, he's such a misogynist, he's such a racist, So America no longer looks like an attractive country. Now, in 1973, when Operation Ajax overthrew the regime, America was very different. People were really attracted by it. Iranians wanted to go there. They dreamt of it. Everyone thought that, everyone had huge belief in America and Western values. And now no one swallows that anymore. Young people don't believe any of that. And so, I think that it's fundamentally because the West has lost its way. And that, so people are no longer prepared to become traitors and turn on their own government and take the the American dollar to to go against their own government like they did in 1973. So that's fundamentally why. But it's to do with a combination of reasons. Basically, the West has lost the power to be to control the world as it used to.
Scott Ritter threw out an interpretation of the ending of this regime change approach in Iran that I found interesting. I don't know how much we can follow it, but he was reasoning that it might actually have been a deliberate approach by Donald Trump to force the hand of the pro-Iran regime change neocons to tell them, okay, fine, let's do it. But then he didn't follow up with the military blow, because that exposes you expose the networks of this group of U.S. and Israeli neocons who want to do that, which now is going to be really, really hard to put back together again once these assets are exposed and once the depots have been depleted and the routes through which these Starlink panels entered Iran have been dismantled. It's really hard to get them back together. So Ritter says, like, okay, maybe it just all fell apart, but maybe the Trump team who doesn't want to do this form of intervention, that has a different plan for the region, actually wanted to undermine that faction. How much credence do you give to this interpretation?
Well, I agree that this failed coup attempt was years in the making, right? So it didn't happen overnight. There was obviously the enormous effort had been invested in this, building up these assets, smuggling in these weapons, smuggling in these Starlinks, and so on. So it was a major investment that failed, and I think that Donald Trump backed out of attacking Iran because there was no chance of any strategic success. I don't think that the plan had failed, where the Iranians had managed to suppress the coup attempt, and then what? The problem with Donald Trump is, although he's absolutely dedicated to serving Israel, and that's his number one priority, and Israel's main priority is to collapse the regime in Iran. The problem Donald Trump's got is his hands are tied by he's not able to put any boots on the ground, because the American people obviously don't want, they're totally against having foreign invasions. So he can only, what could he do? I mean, all he can do is bomb and try decapitations. Well, he'd obviously tried that. And it didn't work. So there was no realistic prospect of strategic success. So essentially, this imperial attempt to collapse the Iranian regime was defeated. And I think that if there was any chance of anything working, they would have continued, and they will try again if they can, but they failed. And it's important to note that this is their failure is an absolutely historic failure, because if they had succeeded, then Iran would have been plunged into total chaos, right? It would have lasted probably for decades or even a century of total chaos and civil war of all these groups, because Iran would have been, struggling, and obviously there would be no the axis of resistance across the Middle East would clearly lose its main sponsor, and so the Israeli project could expand, and Palestine would have been wiped out, and Israel would have been able to, fulfill its dreams and secure its hegemony across the whole region and expand into all the other Arab countries that it wants to expand into, because it's really only Iran that is keeping Israel's project in check. So the fact that this coup attempt failed has made a, absolutely colossal difference in historical terms.
So are we seeing now a change in actually the US approach to West Asia? I mean, right now, the last 5-6 days, the US seems to be withdrawing from Syria. These areas it held in the Kurdish area of Syria, in the northeast. And of course, as others have said, selling out those allies, right? As in, here you go, and they're now being attacked by these ISIS fighters who are on the government side, because the Syrian government is controlled by a former Al Qaeda, Al Nusra head, right? And really bad things are about to happen over there. But why are they withdrawing now from these positions that they've held for 10, 12 years?
Well, the United States supports the Kurds, of course, it has done for many years, but it also supports Ahmed al-Shara, the new Syrian government. So, they're both his allies. So clearly the Americans have made a decision to let al-Shara consolidate his power and expand. And we can only really guess why that is. But I mean, essentially Syria is doing what the Americans want at the moment. I mean, al-Shara is obviously a very, very pragmatic leader. He's coming from a very weak position where his country is, devastated by many, many years of tyranny and war. And so, he could lose power. Syria could go into chaos, so, the Americans have at the moment, he's obviously doing, what the Americans want, and he's not posing any threat to Israel, crucially. And, that's ultimately what Israel wants. I mean, American policy in Syria is is obviously dictated by Israel. And what Israel wants is a weak Syria. And currently Israel's got that. So, that's fine. Syria is now boxed in. It doesn't present any threat to Israel for the foreseeable future. And so that's so al-Shara has been allowed to make this move and consolidate his power. Now, obviously, if al-Shara should change his tune at any time and start to um, you know show any kind of hostility towards Israel or America, then certainly the one would expect that the Americans would go straight back to supporting the Kurds. But at the moment, al-Shara seems to have won American support. So which is clever of him, to have managed this, because he's got such a weak hand, and he's got to manage so many internal and external problems, that he's done well from his point of view to secure his power across Syria. And this was very necessary. If you overthrow the previous regime, then you have to consolidate your power if you're going to survive, and you have to move quickly, and you have to eliminate other armed forces. And this was what the fault we saw in other revolutions, like in Egypt and so on, was that the new incoming ruler was he dilly-dallied. He didn't move efficiently to eliminate the deep state and remove other power centers, and as a result there was a counter-revolution and they were overthrown. So al-Shara had to do this, really. From his point of view, it's a great success, because the Kurds were a major threat to his authority. But of course, it's not over yet. We don't know, the Kurds have not disappeared. And now there's obviously a lot of bad blood between him and the Kurds. And so, the problem is not going to vanish completely.
Yeah. Let's leave that one aside. But what do you foresee? What is the United States now done with Iran? Because I don't think so, and we still have reports about a whole carrier strike group still being on the way to the Mediterranean, to the Gulf. What are you expecting at the moment to happen? Because I mean, Israel obviously wants Iran dead on a plate. What are you foreseeing? What's happening going to happen over the next couple of weeks and months?
Well, I think we have to expect that they're going to try again at Iran, because obviously, as you say, Israel definitely wants to destroy Iran, and obviously Netanyahu personally has an interest in perpetual war, because this keeps him in power and keeps him out of prison on corruption charges. Donald Trump also has an interest in perpetual war, because this means we don't talk about the Epstein files, which he hasn't released. So I think that they have got strong motives to continue. So I would expect that they will try again with Iran, sooner or later. So I don't think the story's over. But I mean, having now tried twice in 7 months to overthrow the regime, firstly with this 12-day war, and now with this hybrid boots and bytes attack, obviously they've used up a lot of capital, and they've used up played a lot of their cards. So, it seems that Iran has managed to defeat, the imperial onslaught for now. But yeah, surely they'll try again.
Plus, I mean, it seems that Iran has found um, a bit more confidence in its cooperation, especially with the Russians, but also on the Chinese side, we have a lot of people claiming that there are a lot of flights going into Iran from China. So, do you think Beijing and Moscow acted fairly quickly over the last couple of months, trying to prep up the Iranians?
For sure. I mean, Iran wouldn't have survived without Russian and Chinese economic and military support. So, I mean, absolutely, they are, helping the Iranian regime stay in power. And without them, the regime certainly would have fallen, I think. So, um, that's but I don't think that's going to change. I don't think there's any chance that the Russians and the Chinese are going to withdraw their support anytime. They don't want Iran to collapse into chaos. I mean, no one wants Iran to collapse into chaos apart from Israel. Apart from which would love to see Iran dissolve into civil war and chaos and fighting factions. But it's not in anyone else's interest for that to happen. So, but of course, the Israelis are driving the US policy. So, there's every reason to think that they will try again.
What do you think, though, the approach of the Americans now toward Gaza and the Palestinians has actually there's opposition in Israel to that. And whatever we think of the setup that Donald Trump created with this UN Security Council Resolution 2803, which basically makes Gaza a modern day UN protectorate, and which is like, yeah, it's horrible in its own way, but the 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 design is for the Board of Peace plus the International Stabilization Force to go in and replace the IDF, and the Israelis seem to hate it. They don't want to give up. They still occupy half of Gaza. Plus, they kill people daily, right? Since the ceasefire came into effect, they killed more than 450 Palestinians there. I mean, again, ceasefire to the Israelis means that the other side stops shooting while you kill with impunity. And if the Board of Peace plan and the International Stabilization Force idea comes through, that would seriously impede the Israeli strategy. Do you think that this is going to change something in the region?
Well, in my opinion, this strategy has failed and it is going to fail. I don't think that Israel is going to survive much longer, to tell the truth. I think that this war has dealt or the genocide has dealt a enormous blow to Israel. I think you have to remember that before the war started in 2023, the Israelis were already fighting among themselves, and there was, very senior Israeli figures like former prime ministers were saying that this was the end of Zionism, it was the end of Israel. They were saying there was going to be a civil war. This was all in 2023. And then obviously now we've had more than 2 years of genocide, and Israel's popularity has totally plummeted around the world. And particularly, in the Arab world, you have to remember that Israel depends, depends on the Arab countries, right, for security. I mean, one of the things the genocide has shown us is that Israel depends on two factors outside its control to continue to exist, and that is Western support and Arab betrayal. And neither of these two factors can continue indefinitely. And should either of them change, then this is an existential problem for Israel. So, all in all, this collection of internal and external problems, I think, is forming it's impossible to see a way out. They've tried ethnic cleansing, they've tried genocide, it's failed. Ultimately, Hamas still exists, the Palestinians are still there. And I think that Israelis are losing confidence in the whole project. I think that, they're moving their money out. Then, who would want to build a business or make a future in Israel now? The Israelis I know are planning to move out. So, I mean, I think, how many people thought 5 years before the collapse of the Soviet Union that the Soviet Union was going to collapse, right?
True. Then again, this structure has been around now for 80 years. And do you have data? Do we know about like capital flight or people? I mean, we know that during the 12-day war, Israel had to forbid its people from leaving. Uh, it's like, okay, you're not allowed to flee. Nobody is allowed to fly out of the country because it could be a mass exodus, right? So there is these kind of weaknesses, and of course, we don't actually know how many people have a dual nationality in Israel who could like just on a dime go back to the United States and go back to Europe where they came from, right? That's quite a problem to Israel.
So this is Israel's 77th year, right? The Crusader kingdom in Jerusalem lasted 88 years. The French occupation of Algeria lasted 132 years. The English occupation of Ireland lasted about 800 years. Okay, sooner or later, these settler colonies, they come to an end, right? They lose, they fall apart. And we've seen this again and again through history. So it seems most unlikely that Israel is going to make it to 88 years like the Crusader kingdom. And then it will naturally discombobulate, as like apartheid South Africa, where Israelis realize now that when they realize there's no future and that no one wants to go there or invest there and so on, then they'll just vote with their feet, and the country will quickly fall apart, just like Algeria did, which was supposed to be eternal, or and then in a matter of a few weeks or a few months, it just has to reach a tipping point. Ultimately, it's about confidence, and this can happen. The whole thing can unravel in very short order, where in a matter of a few weeks or months, a million people can leave, which is what happened in French Algeria. So I think that we're not there yet, but I think that this is inevitable, frankly, and it's coming. Because of this accumulation of problems. And I mean, I know it seems unthinkable, but, once upon a time, the end of the British Empire seemed unthinkable. The fall of Rome seemed unthinkable, but then after it happened, they seemed totally inevitable. And everyone said, oh, I always knew that was going to happen. So, I don't think that Israel is fundamentally different from any other settler colonial project in the past. And they've all gone the same way.
Do you think in their mind the fall of Iran would be something that can stymie this off?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, they are under, I mean, what the Israelis would like to split up Iran. The Israelis obviously want to split up all the Arab and Muslim countries. This is their goal. They want to control or break them up. And we've seen them break up, they help break up Sudan. They've trying to now break up Somalia with Somaliland. They're trying to break up Yemen into pieces. So, of course, it's divide and rule, because if you can crack up these Arab countries, then this gives them some hope. But other countries can't be broken up like Egypt, but instead what you can do is you can maintain a pliant dictatorship that ultimately serves serves Israel's interests. And, that's what you've got in Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And of course, these are the two most important Arab countries. And, it's so crucial to Israel that Egypt and Saudi Arabia remain, in their current state. In other words, being, not being allowed to choose their own leaders and being run by these secretive and corrupt absolute dictatorships, where they are ultimately prepared to act in Israel's interests rather than their own national interest, and that has to stay that way. But if that was to slip, then that would again be an existential problem for Israel. And this is again one of the problems they've got from the genocide, is that Arabs obviously have watched this in horror, and it's leading to boiling point in the Arab world. And sooner or later, the Arab Spring is going to come back, and sooner or later these regimes will be overthrown, and then Israel will no longer have the comfort of having knowing that the Arab regimes have got its back. So this is going to happen, and when it does, that again is going to be another problem, another nail in the coffin.
Yeah, and of course, this other problem that in in order to be successful, Israel needs Egypt to play along, but in order to be successful, Israel at some point needs to expel the remaining 1.5 million or so Gazans into the Sinai, which at that point would be a death sentence to the Al-Sisi government if that happened, because the Egyptians wouldn't take that. They couldn't. Even if they did, it would just mean that then the war will come to them, because then the bombing would start over there, right? So, I mean, in a sense, this entire project there is it has really boxed itself into a very, very ugly corner, didn't it?
That's exactly right. They have boxed themselves in. I mean, the only way out is through mass ethnic cleansing and genocide, which essentially has now been tried and failed. And so that's there's no other way out. And as the world loses confidence in Israel, then then it's all game over, like it was in South Africa. And obviously Israel at the moment totally dependent on Western aid and military aid and Western support, and you obviously above all US support. But we can see that all that is changing in the polls. It's changed so much in the last couple of years. I mean, the very dramatic change in public opinion, obviously mainly among Democrats, but also among Republicans, and now young Republicans. I mean, this is a huge problem for Israel, and there's no sign at all that they're going to recover from this. I mean, we've seen Mamdani being elected in New York. That was another earthquake. So no, they've completely boxed themselves in, and yes, they would love to push 1 million Palestinians into the Sinai, but Sisi cannot accept that. He's made that completely clear. It would run contrary to his narrative about why he should be in power. I mean, obviously he's got almost no legitimacy or zero legitimacy anyway, so he's struggling. But he's come up with this narrative about why he's the protector of Egypt, and so this would be a fatal blow to his legitimacy if this was to happen. And no, I mean, so he's made it completely clear, so has Jordan, that they are not going to accept this. So that puts Israel in a difficult position. Now, I mean, now Israel's recognized Somaliland and is, clearly has plans to move Palestinians to Somaliland. But I don't think anyone really thinks it's realistic that 1 million Palestinians are going to be moved from Gaza to Somaliland. So the problem rolls on. Ultimately, Hamas is still there. They are not going to give up their weapons to the Board of Peace. No one is going to be able to disarm them. Essentially the war is still on. We're in a pause. We're not even in a pause in the war, as you say. People are dying every day. So sooner or later it will flare up. Nothing is finished. Nothing is resolved. But what's changed is that Israel has lost so much support, and it's become strategically much, much weaker than it was. And this is they're in facing an existential crisis, and I think Israelis are aware of that, and they're now getting their second passports ready, and they're making alternative plans and arrangements because everyone can see now which way the wind is blowing.
So overall, your assessment is that time is now playing against Israel, and when we look at it from Iran's side, the longer they can resist these onslaughts, and we've had 2 in 7 months, the better the situation gets for them. Or do you see as a strategic impediment that would make the future bleak for Iran?
No, this has always been the Arab and Muslim position, that Israel is an aberration. It's against history, it's against geography, it's a foreign implant that has been put in the region, and that sooner or later it will be expelled, just like the Crusader kingdom was expelled after 88 years. And so they know that this is going to happen sooner or later. At the moment, Israel has got things under control because of its Western support, and because it has these, they've managed to install these pliant Arab dictators in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, in surrounding countries that stop any support for Palestine. But this is not a stable situation. Sooner or later, the Arab Spring will come back. These dictators will be overthrown. And, of course, the Arabs, there's no love whatsoever for Israel. So, as soon as they get freedom and they're able to choose their own leaders, then, that's it's going to be so different. So, no, I mean, I think all Arabs and Muslims in the region are playing the long game, and they know, this is Hamas's view as well, that you can't overthrow Israel today, but they're in a protracted war, a protracted people's war. Just like Mao Zedong talked about in his philosophies about fighting long wars of resistance, and that sooner or later, it's very difficult to overthrow a colonial power. Clearly they have enormous resources, but it takes a long time. It takes enormous sacrifice. Whether it's in Vietnam or in Algeria, of course, millions of people have got to die. This is understood, but ultimately the people will win because they can make the price of the occupation too high for the colonialists, and ultimately the colonialists will give up, and because they have somewhere else to go to, and they will think this is not a price worth paying anymore. But the people who live there always live there, and they will remain there, and they're not going anywhere. So ultimately, the Israelis will pack their bags and go back to where they came from.
So the Israeli narrative is, of course, that this is their land, right? That that's their land for 3,000 years, and the Arabs are the occupiers. But I think reality will seep in over there as well. And just for the sake of the people in Israel today, they would need to find a way to somehow live in that neighborhood, right? To somehow make friends in that neighborhood and make peace with the Palestinians, wouldn't they?
Well, I mean, they had that opportunity, and clearly that's been squandered. I mean, once upon a time, that might have been feasible. Things could have been so different for Israel. I mean, Israel has, they've made bad choices, and they've been helped to make bad choices by America. They've destroyed themselves, and to be honest, they've almost destroyed Judaism. Tragically, Judaism has been so damaged by Israel from being, this liberal religion that was open to Jews from all different backgrounds, and now because of this Zionist project, they've, obviously the Palestinians are the first victims of Zionism, but so are many non-Zionist Jews are also the victims of Zionism as well. So, no, I mean the whole project has been a total disaster, and is gradually coming apart. But I mean, I personally, I often think about the 14th century North African polymath Ibn Khaldun, who wrote in his magnum opus, the Muqaddimah. So he wrote about how nations are like people, right? They're born, they grow up, they mature, and then ultimately they get sick and they decay and they fall apart, and then they die. And that is essentially what we're seeing in Israel. And what Ibn Khaldun wrote in Muqaddimah is that typically it takes 100, 120 years. And you have this, when a nation is born, you have very strong social solidarity, what he called asabiya, where you have people really believe in the project at the beginning, and they have, there's a great social strength and cohesion. And so, the nation is established, it's very strong. But then over the years, it starts to, it starts to fall apart. And after people get lazy, they get corrupt, they start infighting with each other, and so the strong nation starts to become weak. And then what happens is it gets replaced by a new group of people who have strong asabiya, who come along, who can overthrow the weak nation, and they can reestablish a new a new nation in their place. And this is the cycle of nations. And this is where we've got to with Israel, that it was set up, very strong at the beginning with very good, solid foundations, but it lost its way, and it's now deeply divided. It's become very religious, conservative, which is totally out of sync with its backers in Europe, who are not religious conservatives. So, these have all led to, and Israel obviously manifests all the problems that other Western societies have now as well, which it didn't have at the beginning when it was this plucky colonial, state set up at the beginning. So, sadly, it's, they've made a lot of bad choices, and so the whole project has failed. But it didn't have to be this way. They could have made peace with the Arabs. They could have, nice, it's a nice idea. I mean, there was never any serious attempt to do it, one should add. I mean, the whole Israeli project, started with the Nakba, and the whole thing has been based on dispossession of Palestinians and violence. So there was never a serious attempt to do it. But I mean, had they tried, then that would have been possible to have a,
And we had the Oslo Accords, we had the Oslo process, we had the idea, we had a roadmap that then was consistently, systematically undermined and used as a pretext in order to do the opposite. Except it was quite sad. But yeah, there were ideas. There were ideas.
Yeah, no, they could have been different, but no, sadly they made bad choices, and soon they will pay. They're going to pay in full for that. But we haven't reached that stage yet. We're still, because they have American support and American power is declining, but still, obviously America still has great resources, and America is still devoted to supporting Israel. So, they can keep the show on the road for a few more years. But I don't think anyone should be banking on Israel in the long term anymore.
Right. Hugh, thank you for your assessment, and especially also the taking apart what happened with Iran, your assessment for the future of Palestine as well. People who will want to read more from you, where should they go?
They should check out Arab Digest, which is the website that I set up about 10 years ago. And this is an independent media company. It's a subscription website, and we talk about all these issues and Middle Eastern politics.
Everybody go and check out arabdigest.org. Hugh Miles, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.